Hello, everyone. A pleasure to speak to you, although I wish this were in person. My name is Sanjay Sarma. The title of my talk is The Future of Learning. It used to be A Future of Learning, but I'm now convinced that it's the future of learning, and it's actually inspired by many of the same thoughts that Baiju just presented. A really great presentation from a remarkable young man. So today in 2020, we confront this global pandemic. Even before this, things were changing really fast. Jobs are changing fast. A lot's been written about it. Technology uptake has been very rapid, as you can tell from this graph. And more and more people are working for themselves. And post-COVID, companies aren't going to expand. Certainly not most of them. Baiju's will. And more students will become, that graduate today, and working people will become self-employed, freelancers, gig economy, call it what you will. In fact, I like to joke and say the 21st century begins in 2021. It didn't begin in 2001 or 2000, depending on how you count, because Amazon already existed, Google already existed. We had 9/11, we had the 2008 crash. Those were both terrible events. But really, it was a continuum. But today, we are spending 1 year, almost a year, perhaps more, we'll see, training in a new reality, which is technology-based. And more, I think we will look in the mirror and say, I need to be the CEO of my life. I also need to be the chief technology officer and the chief learning officer of my life. And in many respects, this is going to transform the way in which we as adults operate, but also must transform how learning operates. I mean, let's face it, COVID-19, a number of industries are positively impacted. Digital companies, online commerce, the ones that are positively impacted. But a number of industries are negatively impacted. Restaurants, travel, tourism, et cetera. And what that means is there's going to be a massive job shift. And that means that suddenly this wonderful industry, education, becomes not just something that we all sort of aspire to, but it's good to do, but because it is an existential measure of societal resiliency, and the other impact of this is no longer will we in the mode where we simply focus on education as a way to pass exams and get degrees with signal value. If you are a freelancer, if you are in a more fluid economic situation, your degree only matters maybe for the first 2 or 3 gigs. And after that, it's your review from your last gig. So it's knowledge transfer more than exams. Exams are still important, don't get me wrong. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is that, as it turns out, times have changed. Think of medicine in the late 19th century. We had limited understanding of human biology, of certainly no genetics. We had no understanding of biochemistry. The blood work you could do was limited. The X-ray hadn't been invented. So in many respects, medicine was a little bit of guesswork because we didn't understand the mechanisms. And the brain is no different. Even going back 20 years ago, we did not know that much about the brain. What's happening right now in our understanding up and down the stack of cognition, all the way from neurons to brain regions to meta-level stuff, what we're finding out is absolutely amazing. It's stunning. And I just have an image here of all the things that happen in the brain. And what this means is that we can actually play offense with education and learning. We don't have to try techniques which were sort of coarse-grained and we didn't know if they worked. We can be much more model-based. And what changed all this and what made this possible was, in fact, imaging techniques and biochemistry and other things. Just the story of imaging is very interesting. There's this long history of how fMRI was developed. It's a very international story. It comes down to the fact that blood flow can indicate brain activity. Just like in a computer, the chip that's hot is doing the most processing. And so similarly, brain regions that are hot are the ones that consume the most oxygen. And it turns out that oxygen-rich blood behaves a certain way in a magnetic field. And so you can hijack an MRI machine and do functional MRI. And this is the story of how fMRI took place. And what happened at fMRI is you can start figuring out where in the brain what happens and get a much deeper understanding of the way in which we think. There are other techniques, optogenetics, et cetera, with which we're getting a sort of an inside look at learning. Which means that if education and learning are going to become more and more critical, do we have an opportunity to really think through how we do it? Now, I've shown the slide for the last 10 years, but the basic idea I want to propose here is that, unfortunately, our educational models today are extremely resilient and very old. The lecture is convenient, so we use it. And this is from Bologna, from the 14th century. And, it's weirdly familiar, right? And then, of course, COVID hit, but that's a whole other story. There's a fundamental assumption in the lecture model, which is that, and it's a fallacy. It is that the brain, the student's brain, is a sheet of paper, and the professor has a pen. And all the professor needs to do is write on that sheet of paper and declare victory. And that turns out to be wrong, because a better model is that the human being is formulating a model of the world. The front part of your forehead, this is called the prefrontal cortex. Think of it as the CEO of the brain. And think of this analogy that I drew up, where you have little nuggets, you get coins, little bits of information, and you want to turn into this amazing treasury of knowledge, very well organized. This guy, the prefrontal cortex, think of him as a little leprechaun, for the lack of a good analogy. And the leprechaun, what he has to do is go pick up this knowledge, run, reshape it, and turn it into a treasury. The challenge is that guy has to be motivated. Baiju talked about curiosity. I'll talk about that. He has to be motivated. He has to work hard. He has to have energy. And this is what cognitive science tells us. And what we have done in our education system is we've ignored it. I'll talk about it. So that guy is the executive function, and the terms that the more technical terms, consolidation, integration, sense-making, saliency. This is what a student is doing when these little nuggets are thrown at them. The problem is we tire the leprechaun out. It takes about 8-10 minutes. And what's a poor leprechaun going to do when you tire him out? He's going to take a nap. And the fundamental issue here is we need to rethink education from the perspective of that prefrontal cortex, the brain structure, and figure out how learning ought to occur. And we haven't done that. And my feeling personally, and the feeling of many cognitive psychologists and many experts, is that perhaps we are approaching a point where we can do that. I'm going to skip this and just go here. If you look at, as I said, some of these concepts, there's actually quite a laundry list. But there's a nice thing that brings them all together, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. There's something called mind wandering. It turns out that we can only absorb information for about 10 minutes. And after that, the brain gets into, you can actually see it in a functional MRI, where the brain gets into a mode of something called default mode, where thoughts are bouncing around. That's the brain trying to connect the dots. We don't give students a chance to do that. We just plow on. If you look at Baiju's videos, which I've seen, he just gets to the point, nails a concept, moves on. But a lecture is always, 60 minutes, 90 minutes. And we don't give students a chance to do it. There's a whole bunch of other things: retrieval learning, space learning, interleaving, faded examples. I mean, I will not go through the laundry list. What I'll do is I'll just give you some examples that I actually talk about in my book, which I'll also mention later. and in other books. There's a lot of very interesting work on this. And the issue is, why don't we apply it in our regular teaching? Here's a simple one. This is actually research done at edX by Philip Go and others at MIT and edX. Just for disclosure, I sit on the board of edX. I've been talking to Anant Agrawal about this for some time. Ignore the red graph here. Just look at the green. What this is if you increase the length of a video, what is the median time that students watch? Well, here's what happens. You increase the length of video. If it crosses 9 to 12 minutes, students not only stop watching, they actually give up earlier. There's a very natural tendency. We want knowledge in small chunks. You exceed that, the mind goes into a natural state. That's the technical term for it. I'm not joking. It's called mind wandering. We fight it in every lecture. And then we wag a finger at a student and go, why aren't you paying attention? Here's another one. This is a very complicated graph. So I'll just tell you what it means. It turns out, and this is based on the work of Ebbinghaus, it turns out that forgetting is a fundamental step in learning. So if you are about to forget something, just as when you're getting rusty, if you're reminded of that concept, you remember it a lot better. That's called, and what that means is we really should be doing space retrieval or space learning, which many of you may have read about. And software programs like Duolingo apply this, but in fact, most academics don't even know about it. And it's also difficult to do space learning when you have an extraordinary amount of material to cover and a semester to finish it. So you just, fire hose it to the student and then test them and declare victory. But in fact, true learning happens when you're about to forget something. And the reason for that is the brain actually selects the things that it has been told don't forget. And it does that just when it's forgetting it. So forgetting is an important step in learning. Here's another one. So it turns out that, let's say that you're learning mathematics, and this is actually a real paper, a real reference, and it's there. It's the Rohrer and Taylor. So let's say that you're learning to calculate the surface area of a sphere and the surface area of a cone. You're better off doing cone, sphere, cone, sphere, cone, sphere, than cone, 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 sphere, sphere, sphere. Because the brain loves those changes. We learn in the loading activity. When you load the program to calculate the area of a surface area of a sphere, a cone, it's the loading that's the learning. Once you've loaded it, if you do cone, 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 you're actually not stressing the brain enough. It doesn't learn. By the way, this is similar to interval training. This is similar to the way sports are taught. It's just repeated across domains. And yet every book, every course is surface area of a cone, the chapter on that, or the section on that, and the section on spheres. And this applies to art, it applies to everything. It's fascinating, and yet we ignore it. Baiju talked, I thought, rather movingly about curiosity, about remembering the teacher who made the topic interesting. This is a busy slide, but I'll just tell you what it is. These things work better in person, trust me. There was research conducted in California, and what they found was that you could, with using EEG, alpha, gamma, theta waves, you could figure out at what brainwave patterns correspond to good learning and what don't. And what they concluded was there is, in fact, a very specific brainwave pattern that corresponds to good learning, but they couldn't figure out what, actually, sorry, this research was done at MIT. Then a group in California discovered, or they put the English word to that. And it turns out the English word is curiosity. It turns out when one is curious, the brain delivers dopamine. It's called the dopaminergic circuit. And when that happens, you learn better. It's like saliva and hunger. So these are amazing things we know. And here's another one. Baiju talked about soccer. You can't learn soccer online. Absolutely you can't. In fact, can you learn physics online? Well, it turns out that if you work with your hands, you learn it better. It's called embodied cognition. It has to do with the way the motor cortex gets engaged. And there's some really amazing work in that. So I wrote a book about it. It's called Grasp. It actually came out only last month. And I captured some of these thoughts. But I have to say that much as I'm proud of my book with my co-author, Luke Quinto, There's an amazing amount of literature there and really good books out there. Make It Stick is another one. The psychologist Anders Ericsson, who passed away tragically a couple of months ago, wrote a book called Peak, The Science of Expertise. There's some amazing work out there that we do not take seriously that I think the education community ought to. So here's how we teach today. So I took that laundry list of principles and I put it on in the column on the left. And then I have 3 columns: in person, online, and not done well, as in we don't do it, or we do it not so well in general in education, schools and colleges. So today we do lectures in person. The tragedy is, I'll come back to it, that's better done online. And we occupy all our time teaching lectures in person. Why? Because we're completely exams focused. And you just want to make sure student passes the exam. Okay, then what do we do? What do we do with all the other things? Well, we sort of don't do it. We don't do the retrieval effect. We don't do spaced repetition. We don't do interleaving. We don't do faded examples. And the one thing you could really do in person, coaching, we don't do that much. Hands-on learning, we don't do that much. That's the tragedy. And what happens is that in some ways, the success of Zoom University, and this is not a knock on Zoom, it should not have been that easy. It should have been more difficult. But because we were doing lectures today, putting students on Zoom ain't so much worse. Actually, when we come back from Zoom, we're going to look at each other and go, oh my God, are we doing the same thing that we did in Zoom, except I'm further away from the professor and I can't hear her? So this is the world we're in right now, the Zoom University. Now, the approach that we proposed, many of us, Baiju talked about it, is actually do the lectures online, but not live like in Zoom, but asynchronous with videos, right? So I'm going to pause this. You don't actually have to see this video, I'm sorry. But what this is Eric Lander, one of the people who sequenced the human genome, giving a lecture online. It's a video, it's 700x, it's an edX course on learning, on biology. I mean, what better, you can do a lot better than that. So do that online, whether it's Khan Academy or 3 Blue, 1 Brown or Missing Minute Physics, or really well-produced content on a topic that none of these people cover. And if you do that, it gives you the affordance to actually flip the classroom. So what I'm going to do now is flesh out and make the flipped classroom much more multidimensional. In the future, lectures should be online. And in the future, the things that you cannot do in person, like retrieval effects, spaced learning, interleaving, faded examples, they can be baked into an online platform. And that's what's happening. That's the future, right? You can only do that online. It's very hard to do that in person. You can do spaced learning really in person. It's actually very difficult to do it because you've got to figure that Joe is beginning to forget something and I need to go remind Joe so that I can make it more vivid in Joe's imagination. And they're about to forget, so I'm going to remind them now and then they'll remember it longer. And that probing of, are you remembering, are you forgetting, that's very hard to do in person. A really good teacher could do it, but not with 100 people in the classroom, or certainly not with the 500 people in the classroom. Now, online, what you can do is actually you can probe the student because you can give them a little teaser and say, hey, do you remember that? And you can sense they're forgetting it. This is good because now you can remind them. By the way, I should tell you that spaced retrieval is so powerful that it's been replicated in worms and fruit flies, and actually to some extent in snails. That's all in the book, by the way. And of course, that's not a target market for the modern education industry, I don't think, but nonetheless, it tells you how fundamental some of these things are. Now, on the flip side, the things tragically you could, must, and students thirst for to be done in person. We don't do it. And that's the one thing that makes in-person valuable. And by the way, one of the sort of lessons I've learned from my reading of the literature and writing this book and writing other reports on this, you know, when we entered the field of looking at the cognitive science of learning, I had this expectation that perhaps what we would learn would be very clinical and cold and, you know, not really human. But actually what I discovered was the cognitive science gives us lessons on learning that are warm and human. And they agree more with Maria Montessori than with all the sort of the very industrial approach to education that we see around. And the reason for that, from an evolutionary perspective, I would argue, is because learning is a human prerogative. The human beings are immature for the first 18 years of their lives. We don't let them drive until they're 16 or 18. We don't let them drink, play with kids until they're 21. That's because the prefrontal cortex grows in only in the late teenage years. And the human being is learning. That's why we're so adaptable. And parenting and being a child are teaching and learning. And that's the template. And all the cognitive science confirms that. And so context, intent, why do you do this? Why do you calculate, use Pythagoras' theorem, which by the way is an excellent little video in Baiju's course, if I recall. Why is it important? What's the history? How did Pythagoras and other people, Pythagoras is not the only one, discover the triples, the Pythagorean triples? Actually, the Sumerians came up with that. And then making students curious. Every parent knows when the child's eyes are glazing over and to back off. And then you come back and remind them later. That is spaced repetition. Coaching, oh my God, the importance of coaching cannot be understated. Carl Wyman, the Nobel laureate, professor at Stanford, wrote a paper on deliberate practice in education. That follows on the work of Anders Ericsson on deliberate practice, the science of expertise. Coaching is amazing. Every sports person knows this, and everyone who watches sports knows this. Hands-on learning, I've already talked about it. This is the future, a multi-dimensional flip, where the classroom does the things online can't do. The tragedy is this: as long as we waste and squander in-person co-presence, the privilege of being together, as long as we waste it on doing the things online does better, we're in trouble. And the universities and the schools that succeed are the ones that focus on the things that online could not do better, that only a human touch would permit. So the classroom, when we have the privilege of proximity back, we must make the classroom count. I mean, this is a promise we must make to ourselves. And that's really what's driven MIT in its open learning journey, really. I mean, it's, we launched 20 years ago, we launched OpenCourseWare. It's had, staggering numbers of visits, more than 168 million unique users. Then we launched, as you probably know, MITx, and we spun out edX. MITx has reached 4 million users, about 250,000 certificates. edX has crossed 100 million enrollments, and 130, it's actually 150, almost 150 partners. Those numbers are already out of date. Online, as Baiju said, is booming right now. Students are flocking to it, partly out of compulsion. But the crazy thing is, we will have spent a year training this way, and people will not go back to normal. And we have, those of us in the educational industry, will have to offer a lot more in person to make it worth it. It's a real challenge. I thought Baiju put it beautifully. The MicroMasters, we invented at MIT, and along with edX, and now edX has scaled it. We now have more than, actually 66 MicroMasters from a bunch of universities. New credentials are being invented. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes to talk about the role of the university, and then I'll end with one other slide. So the university historically has evolved from, going back. The first universities were actually the Buddhist and Hindu universities in now Pakistan, Takshila and Nalanda. But the modern university movement derives to a large extent from Islamic universities, one in Morocco, and then the European universities, Bologna, Oxford, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at them, they derive from a somewhat monastic sort of tradition, because the book was the holy book, and that's what you were teaching. And this is true of every religion, by the way, and every region. A lot of universities come from there. And the degree comes from in fact, a university was a guild of scholars, and the degree comes from the Arabic word ijazat, which means the permission to become a teacher. So a university is actually a guild, but it was somewhat monastic. And a lot of university towns are small towns, not all of them. And it's all about getting people in and keeping them in that cloister, literally, so that they can formulate a shared understanding. In the 21st century, which, as I said, begins next year, universities have to become, I think they have to reinvent themselves. They have to become a place, they have to become the public square, they have to become a place of action, creation. This also ties into all the stuff I talked about: coaching, context, embodied cognition, where you're building things, making things. Universities also have to expand their mission in another way, which is they can't cater to their standard students. The future of work depends on universities too, as I said right in the beginning. And we have to reinvent our missions to take this challenge on, to remain both credible and, frankly, provide a valuable, become a valuable asset for society. So to capture this, at MIT, we are developing something that we call Agile Continuous Education, which also has the happy acronym ACE. Agility is something we learn about, of course, in innovation, and something I teach. Continuous, because I think we all agree with this, with the half-life of skills shortening. We can't think of education as a one and done. It's got to be, it's like going to the gym. Imagine if I told people you could go to the gym for the first 4 years of your life and you're ready for the rest of your life. Well, no, you go every few days you go to the gym. So it's continuous and education. So the way we define it is a combination of three things that people will do. Maybe they don't do all three, but it's three sort of components to it. One is online courses and micro-credentials. So you take online material. Even if it's computer programming, the second piece is computer programming in its truest sense is actually a team sport. You can do stuff online, but wouldn't it be great if you can get together with a bunch of people? You've just learned AI. You want to get together a bunch of other AI graduates of a certificate program in AI online, and you get together and you do a hackathon, you write a piece of AI code, you do a pitch. So that's what we call boot camps. MIT's been doing it for several years now. We've done a bunch with a lot of success. Students love it. That's the one thing in my office in open learning that we do that is in person. Today, during COVID, we're also trying to do that online, and it's going quite well. But there is something to co-presence there, because you can coach, you can look over people's shoulders, give them advice. And the third piece of the puzzle is apprenticeships and internships. So the idea is you apprentice or you intern. So one is online, one is on-site, and one is at work. And the idea here is that the prediction or the proposal is that people will circulate between those three modes continuously to stay up to date in the 21st century as the needs of economies and societies change. As an aside, I should say that MIT and a bunch of really great universities, we've also announced something called the Digital Credentials Consortium, DCC, and what we're working on is most likely blockchain, a way to democratize the transcript. So the basic idea is that when you take these different, when you have achievements that are across different entities, you get a digitally verifiable credential. So when you put it in your LinkedIn page, you don't just say, I took this course, you put in a link. And if someone clicks on it, you can prove that you did all that. And that way we take the transcript, which today is in the hands of a single university or an entity. And how ironic that if you get 195 credits out of 196, you're declared a dropout. But if you get 196, suddenly it's successful, right? So we want to unbundle it, put it in the hands of the students, and students can build their own career trajectories in a provable way and then display them to the world. So that's the last piece of it. So this is called Agile Continuous Education. It's based on a couple of decades of work at MIT. And it builds on things that we're doing, many of you are doing, and it builds on this philosophy that with online as a new instrument in the orchestra of education, we will, pardon my romantic sort of terminology here, make a new kind of music, and a music that the 21st century is going to demand. So thank you very much, and please stay safe and be well.